BierTalk. Gespräche über und beim Bier.
Hello and welcome to our podcast BierTalk. Today we have another English episode and we talk to John Keeling. John was head brewer and is now global ambassador at Fulle's Brewery in Chiswick, London. He joined the brewing industry as a laboratory technician for Wilson's Brewery in Newton Heath, Manchester in 1974. And, inspired by what he saw, left in 1977 to study for a degree in Brewing and Distilling at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. In January 1981, he joined Fulle's as a junior brewer. He has since held various positions at Fulle's, culminating in his promotion to Brewing Director in April 1999. During his time as director, over £60 million has been invested in developing the brewery. In January 2017, he handed over the reins to Georgina Young, Fulle's first ever female head brewer, but remains a global ambassador for the company. John is an acclaimed judge and speaker for many beer competitions around the world. I met him after our judging at the World Beer Awards 2022 in one of his favorite pubs, the Tap on the Line at Kew Gardens Station. So, hello John, thanks talking to me. Let's start with your personal beer history. How did you get into brewing?
I started brewing in '74 at Wilson's Brewery, which is part of the Watney Empire. I left school when I was 17, and I joined them. And because of that, I got really interested in making beer. I hated school. I didn't want to go back to school. I didn't want to do anything to do with education. And my mum said, if you don't go back to school, you got to get a job. And by the way, they're interviewing for people at the local brewery. So I went to that and I got the job, and I got more and more interested in making beer. And more as my career has gone on, I've got more and more interested in the world of beer. The change over the last 40 odd years of my career has been quite profound. I think it's been one of the biggest changes in the brewing industry ever. Most changes in the brewing industry happen over a longer period, but you've had changes. And we were just talking about the influence of German brewing on the world. When I started brewing at Fulle's in 81, everybody around the world was influenced by German brewing. Very, very few people were at all influenced by British brewing or even Belgian brewing. And you could say those are the three schools of brewing. Yeah, Czech as well. But the Czech and German are very similar. Yeah. I found that everywhere you went in, say, the States, had a German-type brewing system and made German-type beers. Not as well as the Germans, might I say, and not as tasty as the German beers or the Czech beers. Yeah. Czech and German, British versions of lager were awful. And by and large, within the big companies, still are awful. They're not as good as German brewers make their style of beer, and Czech brewers make their style of beer. But since the craft beer revolution was based on IPA, which is essentially a British style beer. Yes. And if you notice, most of the breweries now around the world do predominantly British style beers. Though I have noticed again, it's going full circle, is now they're much more interested in making lagers as well. And you will have people like Utopian in England, and Lost and Grounded in Bristol, and they make their name on making lager. And I also, if you go even further back to when Meantime started, Alistair Hook, the founder of Meantime, studied in Germany how to make beer. He was a friend of mine. I haven't seen him for years and years because he's made a lot of money and gone playing golf, I think he's gone. He was a great brewer and very strongly influenced by the German tradition. But he was a British brewer, and he still had this fondness for British-style beers. Everybody's wanted to make an IPA in Britain, modern styles of beer, and now they're going back to look at mild and bitter. Yeah. Yes, which is the traditional beer that I grew up on. So when I first joined Wilson's way back in '74, I drank bitter because that was the most popular beer, and cask bitter. And I still drink cask bitter. And then as the craft beer revolution came about, I started drinking more and more wider style. But since I've been retired, I've gone back to only drinking cask bitter. And less of the wider style. So I've gone back to my 18-year-old self.
Back to your drinking roots.
Back to my drinking. And cask beer is still my favourite beer. Even in hot weather, it's my favourite beer. I think it is the best beer you can buy in Britain.
Yeah.
It is also the worst beer you can buy in Britain too. And that's purely because of its quality problems. It is a beer that only has maximum 6-week shelf life. And once opened, really you should have sold it within 3 days. And I think the unfortunate thing for cask beer is that a lot of cask beer is sold 4, 5 and 6 days old, and it's nowhere near its best. This is superb.
Yeah.
It's really good. We just got a pint of London Pride, which is fresh.
Which is fantastic. Yeah, one of my most favorite beers, and to be honest, I sometimes simply compare it with our Keller beer at home.
Yes.
Because it's an easy drinking beer. You sit on big tables, you chat with your friends, you have it the whole evening, and it's just nice. Yeah.
And some people say about these beers that are really incredibly drinkable and sessionable, that they're simple beers. They are not simple beers. What makes them sessionable is their complexity, okay? Not their simplicity, right? You might think, oh yes, this is really easy drinking and whatever, but it's easy drinking because it's keeping you interested.
Yeah.
And that's the complexity, not just the flavour, but of the texture, of everything that goes with the beer. And these beers, I think, I define great beers of having 4 main qualities. One of it is quality itself, which I defined as how it hits the specification, how it is brewed through the process, so it's very consistent. And quality. Then you have to have flavour and character. And character in the beer is how it varies within its specification. But it varies in a way that you still recognise it. Yeah. So the first 2 sips of the beer, you say, oh, that's London Pride.
Yeah.
And then you say, oh, it's a little bit more fruity than the last time I drank it. And then it reveals something else of itself later on. And it's like having a conversation with a friend rather than having just a drink of beer, you know. Yeah. And if you think about it, you know, if you go and see your friend at the bar and they've had a haircut, they're still your friend.
Yeah.
Just because the London Pride is more fruity today doesn't mean it's not London Pride.
Yeah.
It still is London Pride. I'm telling you something I told you 4 months ago, if you remember, in actual fact. This is a biological product. It's not a chemical product. And why would we expect one field of barley to grow identical to the field next door? Why do we expect a field of hops to grow identical every year? The answer is they don't. So why do you think the beer is going to be identical every year, every season? And hops only crop once a year. So why will it taste the same in July as it does in December? Yeah? And again, you're not the same.
Yeah.
You know, every time you turn at the pub, you're not the same. You could have just had a row with your missus and you're in a bad mood.
Yeah.
So your tasting, the way you feel affects the taste, how you taste beer. And all great drinks have character, whether they're wine or whiskey or beer. Great drinks have character. But as they become more and more consistent, they drive character and flavour out, because it's not about having one without the other. It's about how do you achieve the balance of all those things, the elements that go in. It's the balance that counts, not that you favour consistency above flavour. And the more you drive flavour out, the easier it is to make consistency. If you want to drink the world's most consistent drink, have a vodka and tonic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if that's all you want, then that's fine by me. But if you want drinks of character, then you have to explore them. And by and large, the bigger companies don't make the drinks of character. It is the smaller companies that do that, because it is their calling card. It is their reason to exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't knock producers like Heineken and Carlsberg, because what they produce is a hugely refreshing, consistent drink, yeah? Which many people enjoy. Many people enjoy. But the same thing is true of wine and of whiskies. There are whiskies that are less characterful, but still people buy them and enjoy them because they supply what they want. So who am I? I am one person. I have my own taste. Yeah? I know what I like. I know what I'm interested in. I know what arts I like to look at. I know what films I like, and I know what music. Why am I the same as you? I am not the same as you. Yeah, and I might go for obscure jazz bands from the United States, and you might prefer Beethoven.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Or we might both like Beethoven.
Maybe.
Yeah. So in the end, it doesn't matter as long as you can get the beer that you like. And I like sitting here on a summer's day drinking a pint of London Pride.
Yeah.
So it suits me.
What is really a wonderful situation.
Yeah.
Some of your words brought me to a maybe challenging question.
Yeah.
Do you think that the craft IPAs and pale ales are still more or less British beers, or isn't it also something the American movement turned it around and made it different?
They did, but you've got to understand how influence works. So what happened is you had this bunch of people way back in the 80s, John Hall from Goose Island, Mr. Ken Grossman, Garrett Oliver, and they were influenced by British style beers. Yes, but they did something special. They put an American influence onto those beers. Then what happened is those American influenced beers, they became American and they came back to Britain.
Yeah.
And the British brewer says, oh, I like that, I want to copy that. So influence washes out and it washes back.
Yeah.
And I bet you now there are American brewers thinking, oh, this mild style is quite nice. Let's make a mild. But when I travel around the world and I go to countries like Brazil or Australia or whatever, which I used to do as part of my job at Fulle as an ambassadorial role, I used to say to the Brazilian brewers, don't just copy American style, don't just copy British style, make it Brazilian.
Yeah.
Your influence is British, your influence is American, but you're Brazilian brewers. Okay? And put an ingredient you can only find in Brazil in it for that effect. Or do it the way you like to make it. I still think English IPA is better than American IPA because that's my taste. And I prefer a heavily hopped IPA from England, but I like the Golding hop to be predominant in that beer, not Cascade.
Yeah.
It makes a different beer when you use Cascade. I think Cascade is a very fine hop, and I think there's many fine American hops. And I've used them. I used them in my brewery. But I didn't use them in making an English IPA. I used them in making an American IPA.
Yeah, for me also, maybe the main difference today is that the British beers have more the malty character also.
Yes.
And the modern Americans are more or less so pale and just like a canvas for hops, but nothing in them.
There is a thought in brewing around the world, and I've heard this craft brewers, that you want no influence of the yeast, you want no influence of the malt. All you want is pure hop flavour. To me, that makes boring beer.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of IPAs are as boring in their flavour as standard lagers are around the world.
Yeah.
Because it's not because they're not powerful in flavour, it's because they're boring in flavour. They have nothing behind those big hop flavours to keep you interested to drink more than one pint.
Yeah.
And so I think the best American IPAs pay heed to the yeast and pay heed to the malt. And personally speaking, as a brewer, I think my most important ingredient was yeast. And I think the most important relationship in brewing is the relationship between a brewer and their yeast.
How did you do that when you started? So how did British brewing look in the 80s, and how was the role of the different raw materials at this time?
Well, way back in the 80s, you had the big six of brewing, which was Watney's, Whitbread, Guinness even, Allied Brewing, Scottish and Newcastle, etc. And they were largely dominated by, I would call them chemists, scientists, people who were very precise in what they wanted, and accountants. And their entire reason was to make more money. That's why they existed, was to increase profits every year. And you can increase profits by selling more beer or by cutting your costs. They like to cut costs. Yeah. And they did this by thinking of ways of cutting costs. So they would develop, say, what we call barley brewing, which was to replace part of the malt bill with pure barley and enzymes, because it was cheaper. So they would go down these routes of trying to make the most profit out of a pint they could by cutting the cost. They weren't that interested in flavour. One of my jobs as a young lab technician was to test the shelf life of the beer. We tested the shelf life by doing a head retention and a haze measurement. We never tasted it. Yeah, because the taste didn't matter. If it looked nice, that's what mattered more than what its flavour was. And we used to put 55 to 60 PUs in that beer, so it was well oxidised by the time it reached 6 months. It was well oxidised by the time it reached 4 weeks, to be honest. The predominant flavour at shelf life was oxidised flat beer. But they didn't seem to care about that because they weren't as interested in flavour. They were interested in the things that the chemists could measure very simply, and which proved that it was good beer. So if the beer was hazy, it was bad. If it was cloudy, it was bad. Now, that's almost the reverse of craft beer. If it's hazy and cloudy, that doesn't matter. It's the flavour that counts. Yeah? So that's changed as well. So these companies were pursuing that line. The problem that they had was they couldn't sell more beer in a saturated market. And the only way they sold beer, by and large, huge percentage of their beer, was to sell them through their own pubs. Right? Which was, unless they could buy new pubs, not a way to expand. And they couldn't buy new pubs because all the pubs were owned by other big companies who didn't want to sell their pub. You had a limited free trade where people would own the pub, and everybody would try and get into that free trade. But that was very competitive as well. So your beer sales were fairly stagnant. Then we had a series of changes which put that model basically out of operation. We had the beer orders, which meant that a brewery could not own so many. I think it was the maximum they could own was 2,000. Bass owned 9,000 pubs, so they had to dispose of 7,000 pubs. And you could have a guest beer, which CAMRA fought to get into the beer orders. And that had a dramatic effect on the British beer industry. And then you had the rise of CAMRA, protection of cask beer, and you had the rise of craft beer. All those merged together into a movement, which now is where we have beer now. And what the big companies, by and large, decided to do is, well, we can either own the pubs or own the brewery. The pubs make more money, we're going to own the pubs, we'll sell the brewery. That's why Coors bought Bass, Brewing, etc. But the trouble with Britain for international investment is the duty. We pay far more duty than most countries, with the exception of Ireland, I think. And so companies, big companies, have always found it difficult to invest in purely the production side because there is wafer-thin margins for them. And America has got much bigger margins because they pay less duty. We used to pay an absolute fortune in duty to the government. We paid more to the government than we made in profit. A lot more, 3 times as much. So I wasn't really working for Mr. Fulle, I was working for Her Majesty the Queen. Because I made far more money for her than I ever did for Mr. Fulle. Yeah,
Did she ever thank you for that?
No, she never did. I not even got an OBE. Yeah, but that is the truth, and I think that's why British brewing is slow to get new investment, because the rate of return on investment is so poor compared to the rest of the world. So I think that explains a lot of what goes on in British breweries and why some craft breweries fail very easily, because there's no margin for them. They find it very difficult to exist. Certainly when they go over the duty, the small brewers duty relief, which some of them get. And to go beyond that is very difficult for you.
So it's better to stay small.
Yes, apart from whether your ambitions lie. You know, if your ambitions lie in supplying a couple of pubs, 2 or 3 pubs, whatever, and making a small living out of it for yourself, then that is fine.
Yeah.
But if your ambition is to be a little bit bigger than that and make a more comfortable living for yourself, then it is harder. It is harder. It is harder for British brewers.
Maybe back to the first half of my question. How did the brewing process look like in the 80s? So
Well,
how did you work with the different raw materials?
again, what was happening was that the big companies were looking at how to improve the process.
Yeah.
So they would do some innovative things, but they also looked at European style brewing and looked at a Lauterton mash cooker system could produce more beer per day than a British style mash tun.
How did the British style look?
Well, the British style was a single temperature mash, and you would mix the grist with the liquor, and then you would let it stand for an hour, in which it would float, and then you would spray hot water on top and let the wort run off the bottom. That process, you never raked the bed.
Yeah.
You never disturbed the bed. You didn't try to speed it up. You did it, and that produced superb cask beer because it produced very bright wort, which meant that you produced very bright cask beer. No filtration.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was ideal for producing cask beer. But the big companies wanted to produce keg beer, and they wanted to produce it fast. And they also thought, you know, lager beer is very interesting to us. Not that we want to make the same lager beer as they do in Germany. What we want to do is make a 3.1% version of this and sell it at a higher price than we're currently selling our cask beer. And they could do this because the further you go back in time, all lager was imported. Because of that, it paid a tariff on the import, which meant that the lager beer you bought in the pub was always slightly more expensive.
Yeah.
If they produced that in England, they still kept the price.
Yeah.
So it was a double whammy for them. It was they got rid of this cask beer, which was hard to look after. You needed more training to do it, so you didn't have to invest in that training. Keg beer was easier to look after, and you could charge more money for it if it was lager. And if you brought the duty down to 3.1%, London Pride in Cask was 4.1%, you paid less duty as well. So the accountants were rubbing their hands together and saying, the way forward is to produce 3.1% lager, probably in them days 2 weeks. Yeah, they would warm condition. And now it's down to a week for a lot of British lagers. ESB, when I joined Fuller's, was matured for 3 weeks before it went to trade. So ESB is actually matured longer than almost all British lagers.
Is it true that most of these lagers weren't even real lagers because they used the ale yeast and just fermented it?
So
cold?
some of them did. Some of the coffees did. But a lot of the big companies used lager yeast. And they also brewed Heineken and Carlsberg, Kronenberg, other companies. What they did was Foster's, and what they would do is say, we want to sell. Foster's could not sell their beer. Heineken could not really sell their beer in Britain, right? Because it was a closed shop.
Yeah.
But we will sell your beer, and we'll pay something to you, royalties to you. But we're going to make a different version of it at 3%, not at your 4%. And you know, sort of like Heineken were brewed by Whitbread. Watney's made Carlsberg. Yeah. So they could piggyback the marketing and the European feel. But they would not. Very few companies actually produce their own lager from scratch. I think one of the few was Guinness, who produced hard. Yes. Yeah. But Whitbread, Bass, Allied, Watney's, who were the big producers, Scottish and Newcastle were the big producers of ale at that point. All their lagers came from overseas. Yeah. And they would pay a royalty to that company. But they would make far more money out of brewing Carlsberg than they did out of making Watney Special Bitter. Yeah? Or Watney Red Barrel even.
Yeah.
So gradually they would promote more and more lagers. So when you got hot weather, people were drinking lager. It's a classic case of the more marketing spend you put behind something, the more you're going to sell. If you turn that marketing spend off, the sales got better.
Yeah.
So they were locked into this cycle. All the money they would save on production costs, they would have to spend in marketing to prop the beer up. Yeah. And that's how they were approaching it. But from 89, when the beer orders changed, who could be in the pubs and who owned the pubs, pub owners then viewed it in a different way. They didn't have a brewery so they would say, well, what is the best beer for our pubs to make us the most money? They started looking at rate per sale and they became more and more competitive as pubs. What beer would attract people into the pubs, etc. And as you know, around most of the first world, less and less people go to pubs and bars now than they did 30, 40 years ago. So the markets are squeezed, and pubs have to do other things like food, whatever. And it's a different game. And in reality, it's been ever thus. You know, nothing stays still.
Yeah,
nothing is the same. If you think as a marketeer, by doing the same, you get the same result, then you're an idiot as a marketeer. Yeah, and we've had some idiot marketeers.
There are lots of them around, yeah. But I visited some of the smaller craft breweries in the last days, and what I saw is that quite a lot of them have a brewing system that has, on one side, a mash tun, which is also working as a lauter tun, and then the brewing kettle, which is also working as a whirlpool.
Yes.
So this is totally different from everything I saw in Germany. Is that more or less based on the original British system, or is it? Yeah.
Well, what has happened is there's been some innovation, and that's because cost of brewing plants is expensive. So if you have a dual-purpose vessel, for instance, you take some of the expense out. So if you look around the family brewers, a lot of those family brewers are still very traditional and probably have kit that was built and put in the 1900s. Yes? And when we were at Fulle's, we completely redid our brew house and we put combined copper whirlpools because we switched to pellet hops, whole hops. But the last major development we did was in 1993 in the brew house when we put new mash tuns in. We were one of the last brewers probably to put new mash tuns in of any size. And we still refer to that brew house as the new brew house. It was put in 1993, the final bit of it. But the previous brew house was put in 1863, finalised. So, you know, we got more than 100 years use out of the old brew house, and that's what family brewers look at. Whereas the bigger brewers change their brew houses much more. Because they're brewing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they wear them out quicker. And also, the payback on new plant is quicker because you're utilising it so quickly. So you can justify new plant easier. If you're brewing 24 hours a day, at Fuller's, we brewed 5 days a week. Between the hours of 5 o'clock and 8 o'clock. Sometimes we'd only brew 4 days a week.
But that reminds me very much on our small family brewers in Germany, where it's also that maybe a brew house is built every other generation. So something it has to be kept, and it has to be very well.
And partly, one of the reasons why Fuller's needed new brewing equipment was we were growing. So when I joined Fuller's, we were only 70,000 barrels. When I left Fuller's, we were 220,000 barrels. So we needed bigger equipment to make that. And my old boss, when I got the job, he said, when I became Brewing Director, which was 1981, when I joined the company, and he worked from 81 to 1999 as Brewing Director, I said, I've changed the kegging plan, changed the bottling plan, changed the cask line, I changed the brew house, changed fermenter. I don't want to do it again, John. It's now your job to do that. So I changed the kegging line, I changed the bottling line. In my time, we added to the brew house. and we added more fermenters, and we added more maturation conditioning vessels. We kept the same principles. We didn't change the principles. We just added more.
Okay.
So when he left the brewery, I think we were making 130,000, and then when I left, we were making 220. So I just had to add, really.
Yeah.
But we got new filters. We spent, we spent a lot of money in that.
Yeah.
New casks, all adds up. I thought I probably spent about something in the region of £70 million as a director of brewing during that period.
A lot of money.
A lot of money.
Yeah. So we are drinking.
And only half of it went on my house.
Yeah. It's the castle over there.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. Yeah, we are drinking London Pride now, and that brings me to another topic which is for me quite closely related to Fulle's. It's the party guile system, the idea of brewing. As far as I knew, it was like 3 beers, the Chiswick bitter, the London Pride and the ESB, which was... How did that process work, and how did it develop during your...
Really, it was developed by the Victorians, and it based around the invention of sparging. Up until sparging, people had flooded the mash tun, then drained it, then flooded it, and drained it to get different beers, different strengths of beer. It would be the same recipe, but it would be different strengths of beer. And that was time consuming to the Victorians. And then they invented the sparge, which means that while you were draining, you could spray. So that speeded up the mashing process. So what they thought was we could mash it, okay, and we could start running off, and we could sparge at the same time. What we could do is, Fuller's then adapted that to have 2 mash tuns, both running at the same time, sparging, and the first words coming off would be super strong. And you would put them in copper number 1, boil them, then in copper number 2, your wort would be a lot weaker. You'd put the hops in, boil it, and to make your different beers, you would blend the 2 together, going into fermenting process. And that gives you different strengths of beer.
And the hop was only given in copper number 2?
No, the hop was put in copper 1 and copper 2. In fact, more hops were put in copper number 1 than copper number 2. You would get a better utilisation of hop if you only put it in copper number 1. In number 2, sorry, the weaker one.
Yeah.
But that would mean that your weaker beer would be far hoppier and bitter than your stronger beer, which was wrong.
Yeah.
So we put 70% of the hops in the first copper, 30% in the second copper, and then blend it. So you not only blended for strength, you blended for bitterness as well.
Yeah.
And that's how we made ESB, London Pride, and Chiswick bitter. They were all basically the same recipe, but they were all different because they got different strengths and different rates of hop. Also, Chiswick and ESB were dry hops in cask as well and in tank, so that gave them more hop character than the London Pride. Plus, the yeast would ferment differently and produce different flavours because there was different strengths.
Yeah.
The ESB was a much slower fermentation than the London Pride or the Chiswick. So we would only ever use for repitching yeast we'd put from London Pride. Because we thought that was the best fermentation and gave us the best and most consistent yeast. Plus London Pride was our biggest seller, so we always had plenty of London Pride yeast every day.
But you used, for the other 2 beers, you used the different yeast strains. No.
They all got they were not different yeast strains, but they all originated from a London Pride fermentation.
Okay.
It was the same yeast, but it would be slightly knackered, tired, having been in a stronger beer.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So we preferred it to come out of London Pride, which was an average gravity, and the yeast was fighting fit when it came out of it. Yeah? And also, if you, the 2 blendings, if you slightly changed the formula and made the second copper a full volume, but the first copper 2/3 volume, you ended up getting a first wort of about 85 gravity, which meant you could also make a barley wine out of that. So we made Golden Pride as well out of that. But we had to,
fantastic beer, by the way.
yeah, we had to, and vintage is made the same way. So we had to change the balance of the worts in order to get a strong enough wort. If we just do it 50-50, then the wort came out about 74, 75, something like that. Okay, so that meant we couldn't make an 80 gravity beer. So we just changed the percentage. So we only filled the first cup with 2 curds.
So that means that all these beers are blends in different methods. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, Golden Pride would take virtually 95% of the first wort, and then you just put 5% of the second wort just to bring it down to the gravity you want.
Was it something you invented, the Golden Pride?
No,
No, was already there.
it was already there. All these vintage was 1997, and I became brewing director in 1999. But I was the brewer that brewed it.
Yeah.
Yes, because I was in charge of the brew house.
Yeah.
So I mashed it, yeah, and whatever. But we formulated the recipe. Right? We decided how to make things as a team, and that's what I did. So in my era, Honeydew, Wild River, Red Fox, and other beers we developed, but they were all developed as tea. And ESB was developed in 1971, before my predecessor became head brewer. So he took that over as ESB, and he brewed ESB from 81 to 99. I brewed ESB from 99 to 80. So I was in charge of the ESB brewing. And like everything else, ESB, London Pride, Chiswick Bitter changed slightly over that period of time. Because originally, ESB, London Pride, Martingale hops were Goldings. But everybody in the 70s, and still to this day, are saying, oh, Fuggles and Goldings won't exist in 10 years' time. They're too prone to disease, they're too difficult to grow. We need to have new hops. So in the 60s, new British hops would be developed, target North Down Challenger. And the head brewer at the time, it was Graham Yore, and he's 2 away from me. Reg Drury became next, and then I became head brewer. Graham Yore said, well, if these hops are going to die out, we have to change the hops. So he changed the hops to target for bitterness, which go in the copper at the beginning, and then North Down and Challenger as late copper hops. And he changed that in 1976, and Reg kept that exactly the same. And then in 1999, when I took over, I thought to myself, well, Goldings are not dying out. And in actual fact, North Down and Challenger were being underplanted. Yes, and they were beginning to decline.
Yeah.
So I said to myself, oh, that's not good. Let's put Goldings back into the recipe. So I reintroduced Goldings back in. I didn't take anything out, I just reduced the percentage of North Down and Challenger.
Yeah.
So what we did, the late copper hop was 1/3 North Down, 1/3 Golding, 1/3 Challenger. And that's how you respond to these differences. And again, we changed barley variety on a reasonably regular basis. We never stayed the same. And we blended new barley varieties in. We never had anybody say there was a difference. Never with barley variety. And I think also, to me, barley varieties do have an effect on the flavour, but that effect is much less than the change of hops or a change of yeast, or a change of process even. And I think as long as you get good, consistent malt from a maltster, which over the years malting has become better and better, and now that malt is very good, of course barley grows and you can have bad seasons or good seasons, and so there's always something to be done. But I wasn't one of these brewers who thought barley variety was sacrosanct, and I would change it. Probably I changed it 4 times in my period as head there, because I found no need to chase something like Marisotto. It was, 60, 70 pounds a ton more expensive. And I just didn't think that justified the change, the effect they had on the flavour. And when we made vintage, we would often change the barley variety for the vintage ale. But because it was brewed on a party car, we also brewed 480 barrels of London Pride. At the same time with a different barley variety. And more often than not, we would just straight release that London Pride to trade. And nobody mentioned it. So we would have London Pride brewed with Marisotta Golden Promise alongside the more modern ones. And nobody would say it was different. It was definitely within the parameters of the flavour of London Pride.
Yeah.
We had one brewer who said there was a difference. I'm not sure he ever spotted it in a blind tasting.
And I think that's also a little bit the art of a brewer to make these changes so that it cannot be recognized.
I think what a lot of people, and particularly the accountants, don't realise, the art of making consistent beer is not to do everything consistently. It is to manage change. Yeah. So that's what you do, and that's what you're totally used to doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I go back and change the recipe back to the pre-1976 recipe, that would probably be more noticeable. Yeah. Because you can't go back and get exactly the same malt and exactly the same hops. You can only get this year's version of that. And we have seen over the past 20, 30 years that Goldie has increased in bitterness during that period. So Goldings itself as a hop has not stayed the same. It has changed. So how can you make the beer identically? The only way I have reasons you could do that is to get a TARDIS and go back with Doctor Who and get the same material. And that is the only way you can do it. And that is the same for every brewer in the world. And also, plant wears out, you have to replace it. Plant, the way you make beer in the process, you try to make it exactly the same, but that is extraordinarily difficult to make it exactly the same. So beer changes throughout a period of time. The art of the brewer is to manage those changes so that people do not notice. And any changes is viewed in a positive way, not a negative way. And again, it is down to perception. If you have said you've changed something, people notice it. Yes. If you don't say you've changed anything, people don't notice it. And it's the same as when I do tutored beer tastings in pubs. If I say I am the brewing director or the head brewer of Fulle's, this is a really good beer. Everybody in that room, before they taste it, think it's a good beer.
Yeah.
If I tell them I am the marketing director of Fulle's and this beer is a good beer, half the people in that room disbelieved me from the moment I said marketing director. And they said, no, it's not very good, actually. And it's the same beer. So it is perception, how you perceive beer. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, one of the things I learned very early on is, firstly, I'm just a custodian of the beer. And secondly, there are people drinking that beer who have been drinking it longer than I have. No matter the fact that when I become brewing director, I've been drinking it for 18 years, I looked around the table of senior managers at Fulle. There's a quality manager, the engineer, the head of brewing, myself. I was in actual fact the one with the least service. And there are people you could go to any Fulle's pub and find somebody who'd been drinking London Pride longer than you. So why don't they have a voice? Why do you know better than them? And I always made it part of my job to stay in touch with those people, to go to the pubs, to drink beer, not as a head brewer, but just as a punter, and hear what people were saying. And I encouraged all my brewing staff to do the same and bring feedback back. Tell me what people are saying about our beer in the pubs. Let's not rely on marketing telling us. And we were the best interpreters of marketing data than marketing, because we were drinkers. And because we liked drinking the beer. Some of the marketing people never drank beer, which was fine. But they should not keep the data to themselves. They should go to the brewers with the data and say, how do we interpret this? And that's by and large what they did at Fulle's with me. So I had a good relationship with both with brewing sales and marketing. And only working as a team together can you produce the best for your company as well, and the best for the drinker. One of the great things of being a brewer is you're not going to be as well paid as maybe some of the accountants, but you will get greater satisfaction. You can have really bad meetings all day, done nothing. On your way home, all you have to do is open the door to the Fuller's pub and see everybody enjoying your beer. Then that's satisfaction. That's a satisfaction the accountants can't get.
Yeah. Perfect. That's very perfect final words.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot for your time. Thanks a lot for the interview, and maybe we do another one next year. But
Maybe so.
yeah. So thanks for the beer.
No
Perfect. And thank you that you did so much for the beer and Fuller's beer, which I really like, and we have it in every hour courses. So thank you, and nice to see you. And hope to meet you again soon.
Yep.
BierTalk, der Podcast rund ums Bier. Alle Folgen unter www.biertalk.de.